so happy you're all here to learn more about drug approval and reimbursement processes in Canada. This information is really the foundation to ensure that all patients and families affected by bladder cancer are educated and empowered. Again, a huge thank you to the team at Eversana who graciously put together these webinars and all of the work that went into them. We know that was a lot. So I would like to welcome Ryan Clarke back to present us with drug approval and reimbursement processes in Canada.
Thanks, Teresa, and welcome everybody. Wonderful to have you back this week for this important subject we're going to cover as well. So as usual, I'm going to go off camera. I'll come back on when we do our Q&A session. So here's what we're going to go through this evening. We're going to talk about an overview of the processes itself. We're going to talk about special access program, drug approvals, drug pricing, health technology assessment, pricing negotiations, product listing agreements, and then we'll have our Q&A. And don't worry, we'll go through each one of these in some detail. So here is a schematic of what we're going to talk about today. This is the overall drug approval and reimbursement, or what's called listing process in Canada. First thing you'll notice, of course, is that it isn't a process, it's a series of processes. A couple of things I'll tell you right off the bat. This was not created as a single set of processes that have been operating over a period of time. This is a patchwork. It's a work in progress. Some pieces have been there for some time. Some pieces are relatively new. I will also share with you, just sort of right out of the gate, that it's quite complex in its design, in part because it's quite piecemeal. There are a lot of acronyms. I will try not to use them, or when I use them, I'll explain them first, of course. So, as I said, just follow along, and like I said, if there's any questions at the end, we're sort of happy to answer them. So it's important to recognize the various roles here. You'll recall from last week, we talked about what is the role of the federal government in healthcare generally, what is the role of the provinces in healthcare generally. Well, now we're going to drill down to more specifically, what is the role of the two levels of government with respect to drug approvals and reimbursement. So the federal government approves medications for sale, regulates their use, issues patents, regulates prices, monitors research and development levels by the pharmaceutical industry, administers the special access program, which I'll talk about in a moment, and is one of the single largest purchasers of drugs in this country, something not well known, I think, amongst many of us. The provinces have a different role to play. They review medications for listing on their public formularies, they set reimbursement criteria, and they negotiate prices. Just as a reminder from last week, under Section 92 of the Constitution Act, the delivery of healthcare is almost exclusively provincial jurisdiction, and the delivery of healthcare includes the public reimbursement of medications. And then finally, with respect to medications, there are also these national processes where both the federal government and the provinces and territories share joint responsibility, and that includes the Common Drug Review and the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Again, pieces that I'll explain in a moment. I will not be talking about clinical trials or research today, and you'll also notice that pricing of patented drugs does not appear on this slide, and that's because pricing actually runs concurrently across this entire timeline, which I'll expand on in a few minutes. So here's the schematic that we just saw on the previous page, but in words, just by way of overview. I won't spend any time on this. Let me just get straight into the content. So the first thing we want to talk about tonight is the Special Access Program. This is an important program for patients who are waiting for a drug to come to Canada. This is the program by which a physician, only a physician, can apply to bring a medication into Canada for a specific patient prior to that drug being approved for use in Canada by Health Canada. So on the first bullet there, you can see that it needs to be for a serious or life-threatening condition under which, for which conventional treatments have failed. It's also important to recognize here that this program, again, run by the federal government, is simply a temporary license, if you will, or ability to bring a drug into the country. It doesn't have anything to do with who's going to pay for the medication. This program has nothing to do with that. That's another piece of the puzzle when it comes to this, to providing a medication prior to Health Canada approval, but it's not part of this program. And so you'll see number 4 here. This is a quote from the website that says, if there's a charge, hospitals, public or private insurers, or in some cases, patients or their families will cover the cost. I will tell you that in most cases, the manufacturer covers most of the cost, and sometimes a patient or a patient's family might be responsible for some portion, although not typically a lot. Hospitals, private and public insurers rarely, very, very rarely will pay for any drug brought into Canada through the special access program. Okay, turning now to drug approvals. Again, this is the purview of the federal government exclusively. A new drug submission typically involves the equivalent of hundreds of binders of data containing scientific information about the product's safety, efficacy, and quality. At one time, they used to be physical binders of pieces of paper, and now, of course, it's all done electronically. If at the completion of the review, the conclusion is that the benefits outweigh the risks and that the risks can be mitigated, the drug is issued what's called a Notice of Compliance, or NOC, or Notice of Compliance with Conditions, that's an NOCC, which permits the manufacturer to market the drug in Canada. Now, note that the test for safety is 2 parts. Let me read it again. That the benefits outweigh the risks, that's part 1. You have to pass that part of the test first. And if you do, then you move to the second part of the test, and that is that the risks can be mitigated. If you pass both parts of the test as it relates to safety, then your drug will be approved. If you don't, then your drug won't be approved. Notice that the test is not, the drug is perfectly safe. The drug will never harm anybody. The drug has no side effects. Those aren't the tests. The tests are, the test is that 2-part test I just read to you is the one that is used by Health Canada. I should also mention as well that this process, this drug approval process that is conducted by Health Canada, is very closed to the public. You and I cannot see or formally participate in the deliberations, with very few exceptions, and most of those exceptions involve healthcare professionals, not patients, caregivers, or patient organizations. In Canada, we have regulated prices for patented or brand name drugs through something called the PMPRB, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board. Now, it's important to explain that when it comes to patented drugs in Canada, price and cost mean 2 different things. When we go into a store and you want to buy something, it has a price tag. It would say $3.99. And the price that you see on that tag, $3.99, when you take it up to the cash register is what you pay, $3.99. The price and the cost to you are the same. That is not the case. That is not the case with regulated, with patented or brand name drugs in Canada. The price is the maximum amount that a manufacturer is allowed to charge anybody for the drug in Canada. The cost is usually lower, sometimes much lower, in terms of what, for example, a public drug plan will end up paying for that particular medication. The process for determining the PMPR price can begin even prior to approval by Health Canada, and technically continues throughout the life cycle of the product due to PMPRB's price review power. This is what I was referring to when I said the pricing runs concurrently across the timeline I showed earlier. Now, some of you may be aware that the PMPRB reforms that are set to come into effect have been delayed. It actually says on the slide there, January 1st, that's incorrect. It's now actually July 1st, 2022. And that would change the way drugs are priced to some extent, the comparators, that kind of thing, which you can see up on the screen. But I want to say that there's also a greater issue going on here, and that's the entire role of PMPRB in pricing in this country. Back last summer, the PMPRB in a court ruling, trial division court ruling, essentially had their hands slapped for overstepping their legislative mandate. Their legislative mandate, as you can see from the box in blue there, is to ensure that prices of patented medicines are not excessive. That's their word. That's the word in the legislation. Now, excessive doesn't mean affordable. Patented medications are very expensive. Very few people can afford them. But that's not the test. The test is that it is not excessive. That court ruling found that the PMPRB had overstepped their jurisdiction and was now getting into the realm of determining whether prices were reasonable. It's not the test. It's not their mandate. Their mandate is to ensure that prices are not excessive, and only that. So now we're going to shift to the next part of the process, the health technology assessment part, or the, I put this in quotes, do we want to pay for these drugs out of public funds, close quote, phase of this process. Just a reminder as we step into this next part that there are only 3 ways to get a medication in this country with a prescription, outside of a clinical trial or some kind of compassionate use program or sampling or something like that. But outside of a hospital, there are only 3 ways to get a medication. 1, you can pay cash. If you've got the money, you can buy pretty much any drug you want with a prescription in Canada, with a few exceptions, and the exceptions are actually in oncology. But there's a few minor exceptions in oncology that even if you have the cash, you can't buy it. 2, private insurance. Private insurance is something through your place of employment. You may go out into the market and buy private insurance and that kind of thing. And if your private insurer covers that particular medication, then you can access it. But keep in mind, private drug coverage, many private drug coverage plans have annual caps and lifetime caps. So again, even if you have a prescription and you need it and you have private drug coverage, you may not necessarily be able to get it, particularly very expensive drugs. And that leaves only one other way, and that is through one of the public formularies that we have in Canada. If you qualify, and if that drug is covered on one of the public formularies, then you can access it that way. That's it. There are only 3 ways. If you don't have the cash and you don't have private insurance and you don't meet the qualifications of one of the public drug plans, there's no way to get the drug. You can't get it. You won't get it in our system. That's just simply how it works. Okay. So let's start with the Common Drug Review. The Common Drug Review is one part of CADIF, which is the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health. CADIF, this umbrella organization, of which Quebec, by the way, is not part of, it runs these things called health technology assessments, again, for the purposes of determining whether or not we want to pay for these drugs through our publicly funded healthcare system. Let me pause for a second. If you've got cash, this has nothing to do with you. If you've got private insurance, this has nothing to do with you. We're now down that 3rd road, and only that 3rd road of the public drug plans here in Canada. So the Common Drug Review is one of the 2 health technology assessment programs within CADIF, and it deals with non-oncology medications. In terms of the process, a manufacturer or a drug plan files a submission for a new drug to the Common Drug Review. A Common Drug Review or CDR review team is established, which typically consists of clinical reviewers, pharmacoeconomic reviewers, clinical specialists, information specialists, and other project people. And a public record of all final recommendations and other relevant materials, including patient and clinician group input submissions, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, are posted on the CADIF website. There is also a parallel process for oncology drugs. that are seeking public reimbursement in Canada, and that is the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review. Basically exactly the same thing, except in oncology. You can see very similar to the Common Drug Review. So let's shift now and talk a little bit about patient group and clinician group input into this process. So let's start. We'll kind of start with a little history, but let me just kind of set the stage here. So prior to 2010 for a non-oncology drug, and prior to 2011 for oncology drugs, there was no opportunity for members of the public or interested members of the public, stakeholders, to provide input into these drugs that were being reviewed and recommended for public funding. And so in May of 2010 and April of 2011, one for CDR and one for PCODER, patient groups were finally given the opportunity to fill out a template consisting of a series of prompting questions about the drug that was under review. Input was provided prior to the commencement of the review, and oncology patient groups, only oncology patient groups actually had to register with CADIF to have their input accepted. I don't know why only oncology, but they made a difference between patient groups in cancer versus non-cancer. Then around 2016, a couple of changes came into effect. For the first time, individuals could provide input where there was no patient group. And on the oncology side only, patient groups were given a second chance to provide input called feedback. So the first the first opportunity for input was prior to the drug being reviewed. But then after the what's called draft recommendation, oncology patient groups were provided with an opportunity to provide what is called feedback. In February of 2016, but only in oncology, CADIF created a clinician group input opportunity as well. Prior to 2016, clinicians could not provide input into these. So this provided an opportunity for individuals or groups of clinicians to input into cancer drugs under review, again, through a series of prompting questions, just like on the patient side. Input was provided prior to the commencement of the review, and feedback was provided after the issuance of the draft recommendation. So 2 opportunities for comment right from the beginning. Then in 2018, the definition of clinician was expanded to include oncology pharmacists and oncology nurses. Today, or as of last fall, the process has changed quite significantly. It's become quite streamlined. And this is a process that Bladder Cancer Canada has significant experience in providing input around on your behalf as patient group input. So on the patient group side, there's now a single input submission template for both oncology and non-oncology reviews. There's an opportunity for patient groups to provide both upfront and feedback to a draft recommendation, both in oncology and non-oncology. And patient groups need not register anymore, and individual patients is still allowed where there's no applicable Canadian patient group. And then there's some comparable changes on the clinician side, which I won't go through in any detail, just in the interest of time tonight. Note that CADIF does have a definition of what constitutes a patient group for the purposes of drug reimbursement reviews. And I'm going to read it to you. This is a quote. A patient group is an organized group that represents, patients with a specific disease or condition or collection of diseases or conditions. An interested patient group can provide input. We hear from small Facebook support groups and large national charities. So a patient group, for the purposes of a patient group input submission to CADIF, is basically whatever you want it to be. Now, again, in the case of Bladder Cancer Canada, you have a very mature sort of a legal entity that meets that definition without any issue. But I want to point this out to you because for those of you who may be involved in other areas as patient support groups or patient groups or any kind of group, they encourage support and input from any number of groups and organizations. And note as well that patient groups from outside of Canada can provide input, and Canadian patient groups can include perspectives and experiences from patients outside of the country. So we actually have now 3 CADIF templates that serve the entire purpose of patient and clinician group input, both initially and through feedback. So we have one template for patient groups, oncology and non-oncology. We have one template for clinician groups, oncology, non-oncology. And then we have this feedback form, which everybody uses. Patient groups use them, clinician groups use them, everybody uses them, provided that you participated in the initial call for input. In terms of timing, initial input opens 20 days prior to the target date for submission by the manufacturer to CADIF and closes 15 business days later for a total of 35 business days. Then after a draft recommendation is issued by CADIF, the same patient or clinician groups that provided initial input, as I mentioned a moment ago, are then given 10 business days to provide feedback on the draft recommendation. Now, 10 business days when you agree with the recommendation isn't a lot of time. 10 business days when you disagree with the recommendation is enough time if you agree with it. It's not enough time if you disagree with it. So what we generally find is where there is agreement, and I'll show you this in a bit more detail in a second, it's a very quick process to say, yes, I agree, and everything is fine. But when a negative recommendation is issued, then 10 business days seldom is enough time to get everything in and make your feedback known that you want to as either a patient group or as a clinician group. So I wanted to give you a bit of a sense of CADIF's HTA reviews by showing you that in 2021, they issued 55 final recommendations, meaning that they reviewed 55 individual drugs for individual indications and made 55 final recommendations. 48 of those 55 final recommendations, they chose to say, we think this drug should be reimbursed. Remember, these are only recommendations. CADIF doesn't make decisions. They only make recommendations. We'll talk about who they recommend to in a moment as we go through this process. 48 recommendations to say, yeah, we think you should reimburse the drug with certain criteria. Only in 7 cases out of 55 did they say, no, we don't even think you should reimburse this drug. We don't even think you should reimburse it. And then you can see as you move across the table to the right, an indication of how often only patient groups provided input, only clinician groups provided input. That never happened, where there was only clinician groups and not a patient group, where both patient groups and clinician groups provided input, and then where no input was provided. So in only 3 cases out of 55 did no stakeholder at all provide any input. And that's what CADIF wants. They want input. And so this represents a progress from their perspective in terms of getting stakeholder engagement. Now, turning to the patient input template. Some of you will be familiar with this process. As I said earlier, Bladder Cancer Canada has made these submissions to CADIF in the past. The template itself contains a series of prompting questions under each of these input areas. The prompting questions specifically address caregivers as well as patients. And I'll go through each one of these in a little bit of detail to provide you with a bit of a flavor of what it is that they're looking for. There was some debate to some extent at one time about what I'll call quantity versus quality, meaning is it better to have more patient groups provide more feedback or fewer patient groups potentially collaborating to provide one really good submission. And generally speaking, the fewer the better. One really, really good collaborative patient group input submission is better than 6 or 7 from different organizations that perhaps are not up to the same quality that CADIF is preferring be the case in these submissions. So information gathering, what they want to know specifically is, how did you gather this information from caregivers and from patients? And so in most cases, it's done by way of survey. Sometimes you can do interviews, focus groups, and that kind of thing, but in most cases, it's done by way of survey. And I've given you a bit of information there just to kind of frame that up a little bit. Then there's a little bit, just continuing on with information gathering. There's a very, very valuable guide on the CADIF website called Guidance for Providing Patient Input, which also includes caregivers. And it provides you with a lot of guidance. The text on the slide is taken from that. A lot of guidance as to how to do these properly. And I would urge any organization or any individual who's involved in these to take a look at that content because it's really, really valuable in understanding how to do this sort of stuff. Number 3, disease experience, essentially asks for a snapshot of what it's like to live with the disease that's at issue, or the disease for the drug that's being reviewed. Now you'll notice that one of the prompting questions distinguishes between day-to-day life and quality of life. These are the actual prompting questions that you see on the screen there. When you go to the guide, it does not distinguish between or define these two elements. So don't try to do so in your submission. I tried once and it didn't work. Instead, my advice to you is to just focus on the word impacts and seek to capture all that you can. Number 4 asks for your community to describe the currently available treatments. This is where you have the opportunity to introduce or demonstrate the unmet need in the therapeutic area, which is almost always the case certainly in oncology. Number 5 is improved outcomes. This is where you have the opportunity to talk a little bit about what you hope the medication that is being reviewed will do or could do for you as a patient or family or caregiver kind of thing. And then number 6 is the most critical part of any submission. You cannot leave this section blank. This is an opportunity for a patient group to really provide experience with the drug under review. Now, it may be that depending on the circumstances, there will be few and sometimes 0 patients in Canada who've had experience with the drug. After all, it's being reviewed for public funding. So CADIF gets that. But that's where, again, you're allowed to be creative, potentially find patients outside of Canada, clinicians who have patients outside of Canada that maybe you can connect with. So again, you can reinforce the unmet need. Again, this is some guidance that's taken from that document that provides a little bit of detail around how to populate this critical section called experience with the drug under review. There is this comparable template for clinicians, as I've said several times. I'm not going to go through it with any of us tonight, obviously. And let me just move over now to that 3rd document. Then after clinician groups and patient groups provide input, those same groups are given the opportunity to comment on CADIF's draft recommendation. Again, this template is much, much shorter than the one that I just went through with you for patient groups. And essentially it asks you 6 questions. Again, if you agree, it's basically just a series of tick boxes saying, yes, I agree. And if you don't agree For example, if it's a negative recommendation, then you do have an opportunity in some detail to tell CADIF why you object to their review and their draft recommendation, potentially in an effort to change it when the final recommendation comes along. Now, let me briefly outline the drug review process in Quebec. I told you that Quebec is not part of CADIF. They have their own review process. Manufacturers submit branded drugs, generics, and biosimilars to a body called INS for evaluation for listing on their public formulary, on the provincial public formulary in Quebec. After a 6-month review process, a recommendation, still recommendation, no decision, is made to the Minister of Health to list or not to list the drug. And then the Minister of Health in Quebec acts on that recommendation, very rarely going against it, and makes a final decision as to whether or not the drug will be publicly funded in Quebec. In Quebec, input is actually public input. You'll notice from what I just reviewed that input to CADIF is stakeholder input is very framed. It could be a patient group, to be a clinician group, all this kind of stuff. In Quebec, it's actually public input. Anybody can provide input into any drug that is being reviewed by INS. There is an optional questionnaire, but most patient groups don't use it. They simply send in their CADIF submission, which serves the same purpose. And now we move to the final phase, which is actually 2 phases to the overall reimbursement schematic, and that is public reimbursement itself. The first part of this final stage is called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. So a manufacturer gets their final recommendation from CADIF, and let's say the recommendation is to fund with criteria, as it typically is. Next, it goes to this body called the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, or PCPA. It was established in August of 2010, and their job is to conduct joint provincial territorial negotiations for drugs to achieve greater value for publicly funded drug programs. Remember earlier on in the presentation, I told you that the price and the cost were 2 different things. Well, now this is where the provinces and the territories get together and say, we understand that the price is $1, but we don't want to pay $1. We want to pay 90 cents, 80 cents, 50 cents, 25 cents for this drug. And so this body's job is to drive the cost at which we as taxpayers pay for these drugs down, kind of thing. Now let's talk a little bit about timing, as in how long does the PCPA process take? According to their website, their aspirational goal is 130 business days, which is approximately 6 months to do their review. But their homepage also states that negotiations will probably be delayed because of COVID, and we know that that is happening significantly. So a process that's supposed to take 6 months now is often taking quite a bit more. You'll notice in the second bullet there that these are the member jurisdictions of PCPA. It includes all 10 provinces, all 3 territories, and 3 of the 6 federal drug plans are members of PCPA. As you can see on the left of your screen, PCPA keeps 6 lists or status designations as they appear on their website. On the right is a flow chart depicting the various steps in the PCPA process. And as you can see, there are a few junctures where negotiations may not move forward, but if they do, the successful conclusion of the PCPA process is a letter of intent, which is signed by the manufacturer and some or all of the participating drug plans. Remember, I just told you who sits around the PCPA table a moment ago: 10 provinces, 3 territories, and 3 of the 6 provincial drug plans. It's important to remember that the outcome of a PCPA negotiation, a signed letter of intent to fund a drug, is not a national agreement to list the product. In fact, product listing agreements are the final step in drug reimbursement and are entered into by individual jurisdictions, which we'll get to in a moment. The successful conclusion, and not all drugs make it through PCPA, as you can see from the left-hand side. But when a drug does make it through PCPA, it is issued what's called a letter of intent. A letter of intent is a contract to enter into a contract. In legal terms, it's not worth much because it doesn't compel you to do anything. It just says, I intend to do this. And it's got the terms and the criteria and all the rest of it. It's got the cost, the final cost that the provinces and territories are going to pay. It's all contained in there, but it's not legally binding in any way. So therefore, we still talk about that PCPA is not making any decisions yet. I told you CADIF makes recommendations. Well, PCPA is really only making a recommendation to the provinces to fund the medication when it is issued a letter of intent. And this document is not legally binding on anybody. And so that brings us to the final part of the final phase. This is the last slide in my presentation, in which we say the drug actually gets to the patient. This is when the drug actually gets to the patient. We have 19 public drug plans in Canada, 10 provinces, 3 territories, and the federal government runs 6 public drug plans. That's the bullet in the middle. In addition to those 19 distinct public drug plans, it's also important to remember that each one has its own eligibility criteria, who they cover, as well as what medications they cover and how. All of them cover people over the age of 65, all 19. But after that, there's a lot of disparity between what the drug plan in one province, for example, or who the drug plan in one province covers versus in another province, kind of thing. Why? Section 92 of the Constitution Act. There is no obligation on a given public drug plan to provide medications to anybody. There is no legal right to publicly funded medications in this country. None, zero. It is up to each province to decide if they want to. Each province has chosen to have a public drug plan, but they're different. Each territory has as well, and the federal government's chosen to have 6. But you're not legally entitled to this. They could change this anytime. The Canada Health Act, as we talked about last time, also does not apply to medications delivered outside of a hospital. So this is what we're left with, and this is when the decisions are made. In most cases, that letter of intent that comes out of PCPA is simply transformed into a product listing agreement, which is a legally binding contract between a province and a manufacturer. But sometimes, and more often than we may care to realize, is that a letter of intent is signed, a manufacturer goes off to the provinces, all of the provinces, and says, I would like to negotiate this or turn this letter of intent, this non-binding document, into a legally binding document. And the province says, I changed my mind. And the manufacturer says, yeah, but you signed the letter of intent. You can see you signed it. It's got your signature right here. It says British Columbia, and it is often British Columbia. It says British Columbia right here. And British Columbia says, oh, I know I signed it, but that's not a legally binding document. We've decided we're not going to fund this medication. We're not going to turn it into a product listing agreement. Can they? Absolutely. Why? Section 92 of the Constitution Act. And so just something to keep in mind that it is not a smooth process all the way through from CADIF's recommendation through to PCPA's letter of intent through to product listing agreements. There are a lot of places in that HTA reimbursement process in which things can break down, and in which products that we may all think are important to be publicly funded will ultimately not be publicly funded either by anybody or in some cases by select provinces. And I think that's where we should leave it for now. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. That was a really comprehensive breakdown of a very complicated process. So thank you very much. And some great tips too for patient group input. So we'll open up the floor now for questions. If you do have a question and would like to ask it live, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or you're welcome to type any questions into the chat box as well, whatever you prefer.
I'll kick things off if that's all right with everyone. What's the average amount of time it takes for a drug to be approved and reimbursed in Canada?
Yeah, that's a great question, Shasa. It's approximately 2 to 3 years. It's closer to 3 years than it is to 2. With COVID, it's becoming longer. There are some medications that can take well over that. We've had ones that are 5 years, 7 years. And of course, as I said a moment ago, there are the drugs that literally never get approved, never get publicly funded. They'll get approved, but they won't all be publicly funded in every province, kind of thing. But based on the timelines that I showed you on that very first schematic slide, which I didn't review in any detail, you're talking approximately 3 years. It can be as short as 18 months and can be as long as forever, quite honestly. So unfortunately, yeah.
And that kind of begs the question, Ryan, how were the COVID vaccines approved and made available so quickly?
Well, that gives you an idea of what it's like when governments decide they want to do something. The first COVID vaccine, Pfizer's vaccine, entered into Health Canada in, I think it was December of 2020, and it was put in the first Canadian's arm 66 days later. 66 days from start to finish. Now, in all fairness to the governments, that was through something called federal procurement, meaning that the federal government bought those vaccines and delivered them to the provinces. So there was no HTA review. There was no just review about was it going to be funded, all that Section 92 stuff, that was out the window. But the Health Canada process and the delivering the medication to the provinces and getting it into the arms of Canadians, 66 days. So you kind of have to wonder when governments want to do something, and it can take 66 days, you have to wonder how another process in which patients and caregivers are waiting for medications that are critically important to them can take 3, 4, 5, or forever years. So it's frustrating. It's frustrating for sure.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Any other questions?
Just while we're waiting for that, just let me point out something else here in this process that you may or may not have realized. Let me step back for a second and do this by way of comparison. Imagine if you went to court and a decision was rendered by the trial judge that you didn't like, and you appeal. And imagine if you showed up at the Court of Appeal and the same judge who rendered the trial decision was sitting there and again said, I rule against you. And then imagine if you appealed it to the Supreme Court and you showed up and it was the same judge again saying, well, no, I've decided I'm going to rule against you for a third time. Now, with that in mind, first of all, that would be completely unacceptable in our legal system and is unacceptable in our legal system. Now, with that in mind, let me step back to what I just showed you. CADIF issues recommendations. CADIF is the provinces. CADIF is made up, CADIF runs a series of programs that are funded in a very complex manner by both the provinces and by the federal government. But as it relates to these health technology assessment reviews, the provinces fund them generally 70% and the federal government 30%. So they issue recommendations. And then where do they go? They go to PCPA, which is the provinces again. So now the provinces take this recommendation from themselves and they review the recommendation. And then based on that recommendation, they issue a letter of intent, or maybe not, they do something else with it. And then this letter of intent, which was negotiated by the provinces, is then sent to the provinces again to make a final decision as to whether or not they're going to fund the drug through a product listing agreement. I have been in meetings in which provinces have said, well, we couldn't possibly fund that drug because CADIF recommended against it. But that's you. You recommended against it. You recommended to yourself that the drug shouldn't be funded. So I'm really confused. How? But it's not a separate body. It's you. So from a legal perspective, this is built on nothing, absolutely nothing, as far as I'm concerned. That's my opinion. And it does kind of beg the question about how these separate processes, all of which recommend, don't recommend to one another and all this kind of stuff, and these recommendations become relied upon in order to make what is ultimately a decision, is really nothing more than just the provinces recommending to themselves. So certainly from a legal perspective, I take fundamental issue with how this process works. So again, I don't know if any of you noticed it, but that's the system we have in this country.
Did get another question. How do I get my feedback to a patient advocacy group part of the submission?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said, it's typically done by way of survey, meaning the patient group will send out a survey, which you then get to fill out and provide through those survey results, which are then collected and used in the aggregate to reflect what it is the patient organization wants to say. But there are other ways as well. I know that sometimes there are interviews, telephone interviews that are done with individuals, again, patients and caregivers. Sometimes there'll be an opportunity to just even fill out the template, at least part of the template, and then send that back to the patient organization. It's really up to the patient organization in most cases to decide how they want to gather the feedback. But even as an individual, if you saw that a drug that you were concerned about was being reviewed by CADIF, I'm sure you could contact the patient organization and provide input by way of a letter or email or any number of different ways. So that's a good question.
Colleen Hicks is wondering, has any province ever okayed funding for a drug after CADIF has rejected it?
Yes, but it seldom happens. At one time, if a medication was issued a negative recommendation by CADIF, when you got to PCPA, there was an avenue, there was a mechanism whereby the drug could skip PCPA and be sent directly to the provinces for consideration, even if it was a no. That avenue is closed. It doesn't exist anymore. And so if you have a negative recommendation coming out of CADIF, the probability of being invited into PCPA, because you have to be invited in, is tiny. It's essentially zero. If you don't get invited into PCPA, then the chance of a province saying, I know you weren't invited into PCPA, which again is the provinces, but I've decided I want to fund it anyway, is even smaller. So a negative recommendation is a huge hurdle coming out of CADIF. The only way that we have ever seen a negative recommendation, to my knowledge, a final recommendation from CADIF turnaround, is through advocacy, is through engagement by patient groups, patients, caregivers, clinicians, and others to PCPA, to provinces, to say, despite the negative recommendation, because the drug's approved for sale, it's available in Canada, it's approved. It's not that it has no clinical merit, it's just that CADIF says we don't want to pay for it, it's taxpayers. We still think the drug should be publicly funded, and pressure is then applied, if you will, to various agencies and provinces and bodies in an attempt to turn around that negative recommendation. But that is extremely difficult as well.
And you're queuing up the session for next week very well. So don't forget to register for next week's session. That's the fundamentals of advocacy. Thank you so much, Ryan, for these amazing presentations. If anyone has any feedback or questions, you can also send them to info@bladdercancercanada.org. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to next week.